My name is Mike Haig, and I'm the project director of a brand new operation based in the Caribbean called Wreck Hunters. We are looking to teach the skills and techniques of diving archaeology in the clear, crystal clear waters of a small island called Utila, based on the remains of an 18th century wreck, which we now call the Oliver, a perfect underwater classroom. And as a build-up to this course, I'll be running through a number of techniques that archaeologists use in their work. Last time, we looked at the recovery of large objects. This time, we're going to look at the recovery of smaller objects from a site, remembering always, with regards to these activities, that they do require a risk assessment. You need to know what you're doing, and therefore you need to have the appropriate training to undertake them. In this session, we will be looking at the recovery of small objects from archaeological sites. These objects may be made of different materials, some of glass, some of metal, some ceramic, some wood, or a combination of these things. But before we look at the techniques we're going to use, we need to have an assessment of how we're going to go about it. Now, the first thing about removing any object from any site is the fact it needs to be a part of your project plan. You need to allocate resources and funds and equipment to do this work. You can't just turn up and do it. It doesn't work like that. The second thing you've got to be aware of is legislation. You see, most of the world has some legislation regarding the recovery of material from wrecks. In the UK, that's the Receiver of Wreck, which you may know was set up centuries ago to stop people abusing people who wrecked out all their goods, and instead actually encourage them to come forward with the goods in return for salvage. The actual act that this is covered by is the 1995 Merchant Shipping Act. And what you do is any material you recover from the sea must be declared to Receiver of Wreck. If within the year there's no one's come forward to claim it, what is normally made is a salvage award to the finder, and that's normally in the method of giving the object they found back to them. Up till 1997, in theory, the Receiver of Wreck could actually carry arms to prevent people stopping them doing their jobs. I don't think they're ever required to do that. So that's the second thing, is legislation. And the third thing is about conservation and the display of this material. You need to have a conservation lab set up to receive the material you're going to recover, and also need to be sure there is somewhere you can take it. Don't just assume any museum is going to take what you get. So those are the three things you need to be very clear about. So then we move on to actually the techniques of removing artifacts from the bottom. Now, in many wreck situations, the objects we're going to raise come up fairly easily, but that's not always the case. On a 4th century BC wreck in Panarea, little island off Sicily, the wreck itself was located in a volcano. This is interesting because the divers found that they could take eggs down, put them in the volcanic mud, and these eggs would be hard-boiled by the end of the dive. The trouble was that many divers would lose the location of where their eggs were and end up with burnt hands as a result, so we soon stopped that practice. Other strange factors on this site was the fact that bubbles emanating from the seabed did not appear to gain in volume as they headed towards the surface. The reason for this, they were carbon dioxide bubbles, which, as we all know now, water absorbs carbon dioxide. So in fact, the bubbles were getting smaller. And of course, sulfur dioxide was being spewed out as well, and this caused you to get the sensation of your lips tingling, because basically you were diving in acid. But one of the side effects for the artifacts concerned is that many of them were encased in the volcanic crust, and this crust had to be removed on the surface. So the divers would chisel out the object carefully in their volcanic crust, a little casing, and then it would be excavated by the lab. The similar thing happened on the Etruscan wreck in Giglio. The wreck had pitch as part of its cargo, tar to you and me. And what that meant was when the wreck went down, the pitch went all over the wreck, and it meant that the artifacts, in many cases, were encased in the pitch. This, of course, was wonderful for preservation in some instances. In fact, we recovered flutes from the wreck 2,500 years ago. The trouble was we ended up with all this pitch, and which we were not allowed just to dump on some waste disposal tip nearby. We were required to return it to the site. This was done by filling mail sacks full of pitch, handing them to a diver who would then steer them to the bottom away from anything valuable. 0 to 50 metres in no time at all. You had to have very clear ears to do that. In most instances, however, it's not that complex. And the important thing with the recovery of artifacts is that they need to be labelled. They need to be recorded in situ. You need to have a label inside and outside of the artifact in case the label outside gets lost. It needs to be itemised and recorded before it's moved to the surface. You have something called a finds log, which is a bit like a passport, which everything that happens to a particular find is written down. Why do you need this level of detail? Well, it's simple. Because it may be a big gap between these artifacts being recovered and the project being written up. So it's vitally important that we have as much data as we possibly can have to reconstruct the whole process and therefore actually be able to put the wreck together in a written report. Very, very important indeed. There are, of course, certain things which are found underwater which cause great interest for divers. One of those being cannonballs. Now, cannonballs are made of cast iron. The problem with cast iron is that salts tend to penetrate the inner layer of the cannonball, and no matter how long you wash them out for, which can be a year or so, all you end up when you start to dry them out is a load of rust. The Meros projects have been very successful in preserving cannonballs, but this is an enormously expensive procedure. In terms of lifting the actual material, if it's a larger piece, you can bandage it up and splint it before you bring it to the surface. If it's a smaller piece, simply putting it in a box with sand and packed in can do just fine. There's also other things we do with smaller parts of the wreck. And one of the things we can look to do is to take a wood sample. Now, I'm not here talking about dendrochronology, which would require us to have a 80-year tree history, which means a large piece of preserved wood. But by taking small samples of wood, say 2 or 3 cubic centimetres, we can have those analysed. And what it means is that we can get an idea of the wood the ship is made of. Now, as I've alluded to, anything submerged in water is going to lose structure. That's why when most finds come out of the water, whatever material they are, they need to be desalinated over a long period of time to make them able to be released to the air. With wood, it's like this. If you were going to analyse a piece of wood normally, you'd cut a transverse section through it. You'd slice it up in a glorified bacon slicer, and you'd look under your microscope at it. The problem with waterlogged wood is that it has, as other material, broken down, decayed to an extent. So what you do with that is you add alcohol, which gives it structure, and then cut it often by hand. Now, the advantage we have with most woods used for ships is they're pretty clear under the microscope. And basically, oak was the method or the material used for a lot of shipwrecks. In Europe, we had white oak, which was used. In North America, it was red oak. So you can get a good idea of where the ship came from by looking at these type of samples. You can also answer other questions, because often parts of the wreck were made of different parts of timber, and indeed, as the ship would have sailed around the world, she was often repaired. So the wood sampling process can be very, very useful. Normally what is required is a 2 to 3 centimetre cubed area of wood. You keep it wet, you keep it in water, and you pack it carefully. If cooling the wood or keeping the wood cool is difficult, then, as I said before, alcohol could be used instead. And this is true of any other object that we recover from the sea. If you keep it wet, keep it cool, keep it out of sunlight, that's the key point. So, we've now had a look at artifacts being recovered from the site. I also have come across other items that are recovered from sites, often out of context. Many years ago, I was at a maritime auction where a bottle dredged up from the Severn was sold for over £500, which seems strange to me, because the contents of such a bottle would either be poisonous to begin with or certainly undrinkable now, and it would seem you're paying an awful lot for a bottle with barnacles on it. Anyway, each to their own. So that covers recovery of small objects from sites. Next time, we're going to move on and look at surveying an underwater archaeological site. Until then, I wish you all safe and enjoyable diving.